Before I begin, I need to say something. What you're about to hear isn't easy for me to share. I never thought I'd tell this to anyone. But there was a moment, lost in the wilderness of northern Minnesota, when I understood that some stories need to be told, even when it costs everything to relive them. I'll tell you something nobody would believe, but every word I'm about to share is true. My name is David Thompson, and what happened to me in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about this world. I was 32 when I decided to leave everything behind. My job as an accountant in Minneapolis, my small apartment that never felt like home, and a life that had become nothing more than a series of mechanical routines that left me feeling empty inside. The decision came after my father's funeral. Standing there in that cemetery, watching them lower his casket into the frozen ground, I realized I had become exactly what he had been, a man who worked himself to death without ever really living. That night, I sold everything I owned except what could fit in my old Jeep, and I drove north until the roads turned to gravel, then dirt, then disappeared entirely into the vast wilderness of the Superior National Forest. I found an abandoned hunting cabin near Basswood Lake, 40 miles from the nearest town. The previous owner had died years ago, and the property had been forgotten by everyone except the tax assessor. I paid the back taxes and made it mine. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a loft where I could sleep. The roof leaked in 3 places, the windows were cracked, and mice had made themselves comfortable in the walls, but it was perfect for what I needed. Complete isolation from a world that had never made sense to me. For 6 months, I lived the life I thought I wanted. I repaired the roof with materials I hauled in on foot. I learned to fish in the lake that stretched out like a mirror before my door. I chopped wood until my hands were covered in calluses and my shoulders ached with the good pain of honest work. I read books by candlelight and kerosene lamp. I went days without speaking a single word aloud, and the silence was a balm I hadn't known I needed. The forest became my calendar. I marked time by the changing colors of the maple and birch leaves, by the migration patterns of the loons that called across the water, by the frost that began appearing on my windows as September turned to October. I learned the sounds of my new world, the splash of beaver tails on still water, the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush, the haunting howl of wolves that sang their ancient songs under star-filled skies. I thought I had found peace. I thought I understood what solitude meant. I was wrong about both. It began on a Tuesday morning in late October. I remember because I'd been keeping a journal, marking each day with simple observations about the weather and wildlife. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and I had spent the previous day gathering the last of the maple syrup from the trees I had tapped near the cabin. I was sitting on my porch, drinking coffee from a metal cup, watching the mist rise from the lake like the breath of some sleeping giant, when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer. Something large was moving through the trees on the far shore, perhaps 200 yards away. But as I watched, I realized the movement was wrong. Deer move with a fluid grace, pausing to test the air before taking their next delicate steps. This thing moved with a deliberate, almost predatory stride that made the hair on my arms stand up. I went inside and retrieved my father's old binoculars from the shelf above the fireplace. When I focused them across the water, I saw nothing but empty forest. Whatever had been there was gone, leaving only the gentle sway of pine branches in the morning breeze. That night, I heard the first sounds. I had grown accustomed to the symphony of the wilderness after dark. The hooting of great horned owls, the yip and howl of coyotes, the splash of fish jumping in the lake, the rustle of small creatures moving through the fallen leaves. These were comfortable sounds, the sounds of life continuing its ancient patterns. But what I heard that night was different. It started as a low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first, I thought it might be the wind moving through a hollow tree, but the air was perfectly still. The sound rose and fell like breathing, like something in great pain trying to call out across the darkness. It went on for nearly an hour before fading into silence, leaving me sitting by my dying fire with my heart beating too fast and my hands shaking as I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. The next morning, I found the tracks. They were in the soft mud near the shoreline, just 50 feet from my cabin. I knelt beside them, studying their shape with growing unease. They looked almost human, elongated feet with distinct toe impressions, but they were enormous, at least 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide. The depth of the impressions suggested whatever had made them was incredibly heavy, much heavier than any human could be. But it was the stride length that truly disturbed me. The distance between tracks was nearly 6 feet. I paced it off 3 times to be sure. Whatever had walked past my cabin in the night had legs longer than any creature I knew of in these woods. I spent the day trying to rationalize what I had found. Bears could make large tracks, but these were clearly not bear paws. Moose were tall enough for the stride length, but their hooves would leave completely different impressions. I even considered the possibility that someone was playing an elaborate prank on me, though the remoteness of my location made that highly unlikely. As evening approached, I found myself dreading the coming darkness in a way I hadn't since childhood. I built up my fire until it was roaring in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. I lit every candle and lamp I owned, creating a small fortress of light against the unknown. I sat in my chair with my back to the wall, my father's hunting rifle across my lap, and listened to the sounds of the night with new understanding. The moaning came again, closer this time. It seemed to circle the cabin, moving through the trees with impossible stealth for something so large. Occasionally, I would hear the crack of a branch or the soft thud of a massive footfall, but mostly there was just that terrible sound. A vocalization that seemed to carry all the loneliness and hunger in the world. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my chair, rifle ready, watching the windows for any sign of movement. Near dawn, the sounds stopped, and exhaustion finally overtook my fear. I dozed fitfully until the sun was high enough to burn away the shadows and make the world seem safe again. The pattern continued for a week. During the day, I would find new tracks, always leading in a circle around my cabin, sometimes coming within 20 feet of my door. The impressions were always deep, always showing that same impossible stride length. At night, the creature would return, calling out with that soul-deep moan that made my bones ache with sympathetic resonance. I began to notice other changes in my environment. The usual wildlife grew scarce. The deer that had regularly come to drink at my shoreline disappeared entirely. The songbirds that had filled my mornings with music fell silent. Even the insects seemed to avoid the area around my cabin. It was as if every living thing except myself had recognized some fundamental wrongness and fled to safer territory. On the 8th night it spoke to me. I was sitting by my fire, trying to read, but finding myself unable to focus on the words, when I heard my name carried on the wind, not called out loudly, but whispered with a voice like autumn leaves, scraping across stone. David. I dropped my book and grabbed the rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the bolt. The voice came again, closer now, just outside my window. David! Thompson! It knew my full name. Somehow, this impossible creature had learned who I was. The rational part of my mind tried to provide explanations. Perhaps someone from town had told stories. Perhaps I had left mail lying around that it could have read. But none of these possibilities made sense. The thing in the woods was not human, could not be human, yet it was speaking to me with knowledge it should not possess. What do you want? I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, despite the terror coursing through my veins. Silence stretched for long minutes. Then, in that same rasping whisper, it answered, Hungry, so long. The words were followed by a sound I will never forget. A wet, clicking noise like teeth grinding together, mixed with something that might have been weeping. I realized with mounting horror that the creature was not just speaking to me, it was pleading with me. That night was the longest of my life. The thing circled my cabin until dawn, sometimes speaking my name, sometimes making that terrible hungry sound, sometimes falling into a silence that was somehow worse than the noise. I kept the rifle aimed at the door, knowing that if it chose to enter, the weapon would probably be useless against something so large and powerful. When morning came, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of cowering in my cabin, I would face whatever was hunting me. I could not continue living in fear, waiting each day for darkness to bring fresh terror. If I was going to die in these woods, at least I would meet my fate on my own terms. I loaded my backpack with supplies: water, dried food, matches, a flashlight, extra ammunition. I left a letter on my kitchen table, explaining what I had experienced and what I intended to do, in case anyone ever came looking for me. Then I stepped outside into the crisp morning air and began following the creature's trail. The tracks led away from the lake, deeper into the forest than I had ever ventured. They followed an old deer path for the first mile, then veered off into trackless wilderness, where the trees grew so close together that midday felt like twilight. The impressions in the soft forest floor were clear and easy to follow, but I noticed something that made me increasingly uneasy as I walked. The stride length was growing shorter, the tracks closer together, as if the creature was slowing down, being more careful, perhaps aware that it was being followed. After 3 hours of walking, I found the first remnant. It was hanging from a low branch about 8 feet off the ground, a piece of torn fabric that looked like it had once been part of a flannel shirt. The material was faded and weathered, as if it had been hanging there for months or even years. Below it, scattered among the fallen leaves, were several small bones that looked disturbingly like human finger bones. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to return to my cabin, pack my belongings, and drive back to civilization as fast as my jeep could carry me. But something kept me moving forward. A need to understand what I was dealing with, a refusal to spend the rest of my life wondering and afraid. The trail led to a ravine where a small creek had cut deep into the earth over countless years. The banks were steep and rocky, covered with thick moss that muffled my footsteps as I descended toward the water. At the bottom, I found what I had been tracking. It was resting in a shallow cave formed by an overhanging ledge of limestone. At first, I could only make out a dark shape pressed against the back wall, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering down through the trees, the details became clear, and I understood why the local Native American tribes had given this creature a name that meant the evil that devours. The Wendigo was once human. That much was obvious from its basic skeletal structure, though it had been changed by whatever dark transformation had created it. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its frame stretched and elongated in ways that defied human anatomy. Its skin was the color of old parchment, pulled tight over bones that jutted out at sharp angles. Its fingers had grown into claws that looked capable of tearing through flesh and bone with equal ease. But it was the face that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. The features were still recognizably human, but distorted by hunger and madness into something that belonged in nightmares. The eyes were sunken deep in their sockets, burning with an intelligence that was both human and utterly alien. The mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that had grown long and sharp, designed for tearing rather than chewing. We stared at each other across the small space of the cave for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I had my rifle raised and ready. though some part of me knew that bullets would be useless against something that had already died and been reborn as hunger incarnate. Then it spoke, and its voice was filled with such anguish that I felt tears spring to my eyes despite my terror. "Please," it whispered, "end this. Can't stop. Can't die. So hungry." I realized that the creature was not threatening me. It was begging me. The Wendigo had been trapped for decades, perhaps centuries, in a cycle of endless hunger that could never be satisfied. It was aware of what it had become, aware of the horror it represented, and it wanted nothing more than for the nightmare to end. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely audible even in the silence of the ravine. "Don't. Remember," it replied, each word seeming to cause it physical pain. "Was man, like you, got lost. Winter. So cold. So hungry. Ate." It didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. This had once been a person, probably a trapper or hunter who had become lost in the wilderness during a harsh winter. Faced with starvation, they had crossed the ultimate taboo, had consumed human flesh to survive, and in doing so, had triggered the ancient curse that transformed them into something that could never again be satisfied, no matter how much it consumed. "What's your name?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why it mattered. "Thomas," it whispered after a long pause. "Thomas Mitchell was surveyor, 1893. Thomas Mitchell. The creature had been human 130 years ago. It had been trapped in this form, driven by insatiable hunger, for longer than most people could even imagine. The horror of that existence was beyond anything I had ever contemplated. I lowered my rifle. I couldn't bring myself to see this tortured soul as an enemy, despite the clear danger it represented. Instead, I found myself filled with pity for what Thomas Mitchell had become and what he had endured. "The people who've disappeared," I began. "Couldn't help it," the Wendigo replied, its voice thick with shame and self-loathing. "Hunger takes over, not me anymore. When it happens." We talked for hours in that cave. Though talking might not be the right word for the halting, painful conversation we shared. Thomas told me about his life before the transformation, his work surveying the Northern Territories, his wife waiting for him back in Duluth, his dreams of buying land and starting a family. He told me about the blizzard that had caught him unprepared, about the days of wandering in white-out conditions, about finding the frozen body of another traveler and making the choice that damned him. He told me about the decades since, about the periodic hungers that would overwhelm his human consciousness and drive him to hunt. He spoke of the families he had destroyed, the lives he had taken, the guilt that had become a constant companion, worse than the physical hunger itself. "I've tried," he whispered, "thrown myself under from cliffs, walked into fires, but always heal, always come back. Curse won't let me die." As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand why I had been drawn to this place, why I had chosen to isolate myself in these particular woods. Some part of me had been meant to find Thomas Mitchell, to be the one person who would listen to his story without running in terror. "There must be a way," I said, "some way to break the curse, to give you peace." For the first time since I had entered the cave, something like hope flickered in those deep-set eyes. "Old woman," he said slowly, "Ojibwe, wise woman, told me once, before I changed completely, said there was a way, but needed someone willing to understand, to forgive. He explained that the curse could only be broken by someone who knew the full truth of what he had become and what he had done, but who still chose to see the human soul trapped within the monster. It required an act of compassion that went beyond fear, beyond revulsion, beyond the natural human instinct for self-preservation. The sun was beginning to set, and I could see the change starting to happen. Thomas's eyes were growing brighter, more feral. His breathing was becoming heavier, more labored. The human consciousness I had been speaking with was starting to retreat as the Wendigo hunger began to assert control. "Go," he gasped, "running out of a time when dark comes. Won't be me anymore." But I didn't go. Instead, I did something that defied every survival instinct I possessed. I set down my rifle and walked deeper into the cave, moving slowly and deliberately toward the creature that was already beginning to snarl and show its terrible teeth. "Thomas," I said firmly, "you are not a monster. You are a man who made a choice to survive, and you've been punished far beyond what any human soul should endure. You deserve peace. You deserve forgiveness. You deserve rest." The transformation paused. For a moment, the human consciousness seemed to reassert itself, and Thomas looked at me with an expression of such gratitude and wonder that it broke my heart. "You forgive me," he whispered. "I forgive you," I said, and meant it completely. "For all of it. For the choice you made to survive, for the things the hunger made you do afterward, for the pain you've carried all these years. You can let go now, Thomas. You can rest." The change that came over him was like nothing I had ever witnessed. The terrible hunger that had burned in his eyes for over a century simply disappeared. His elongated frame began to shrink, his claws retracted, his skin took on a more human color. Within minutes, I was looking at a man who appeared to be in his 30s, dressed in the tattered remains of clothes that had somehow survived more than 100 years. Thomas Mitchell smiled at me, the first genuine smile he had worn since 1893, and then he simply faded away like morning mist, leaving behind only a sense of profound peace and gratitude that seemed to fill the entire cave. I spent that night in the ravine, sitting by a small fire I built near the cave entrance. I felt no fear, no sense of danger. The ancient evil that had haunted these woods was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt like a prayer answered. When dawn came, I made my way back to my cabin, following the creek until it led me to familiar territory. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had experienced during my months of isolation. The wildlife returned to the area around my lake, deer coming to drink at dawn, songbirds filling the air with music. Even the fish seemed more plentiful. It was as if the entire forest was celebrating the lifting of a curse that had hung over it for more than a century. I stayed through the winter, learning to live with snow that piled higher than my windows and temperatures that would have killed me if not for the survival skills I had developed. But I was no longer alone in the way I had been before meeting Thomas. I carried with me the knowledge that compassion could triumph over fear, that understanding could break even the darkest curses. In the spring, I made the difficult decision to return to civilization, not because I wanted to leave the peace I had found in the wilderness, but because I understood that I had been given a gift that was meant to be shared. The story of Thomas Mitchell deserved to be told, not as a horror tale to frighten people, but as a testament to the power of forgiveness and the importance of seeing the humanity in even the most frightening circumstances. I sold the cabin to a young couple who wanted to start a new life away from the chaos of the modern world. I gave them detailed instructions about living in that environment, about respecting the forest and the creatures that called it home. I told them that these were blessed woods, that they were inheriting a place where ancient wrongs had been made right. Now, 5 years later, I work as a counselor in Minneapolis, helping people who feel lost and alone find their way back to connection and hope. I think about Thomas Mitchell every day and about the lesson he taught me in that limestone cave. No one is beyond redemption. No soul is so lost that it cannot find peace with the right combination of understanding, compassion, and forgiveness. Sometimes, on quiet winter nights, when the snow is falling and the world feels hushed and expectant, I can almost hear Thomas's voice carried on the wind, not the tortured whisper of the Wendigo, but the grateful words of a man finally at rest. "Thank you," he seems to say. "Thank you for seeing me, for hearing me, for helping me remember who I used to be." I return to those woods every summer, hiking the trails that Thomas and I walked together, sitting by the lake where I first heard his call across the darkness. The cave where we talked is still there, but it no longer feels like a place of hiding and shame. Instead, it has become something like a shrine, a place where I can go to remember that even our deepest fears often mask profound pain, and that the monsters we imagine are usually just broken souls, crying out for understanding. The people in the nearby towns still tell stories about the Wendigo, still warn their children about the creature that once haunted the deep woods. But they don't understand that the real story, the true story, is not about a monster at all. It's about a man who got lost, who made a terrible choice to survive, and who finally found his way home through the kindness of a stranger who chose to see his humanity rather than his horror. I keep his memory alive, not just in my own heart, but in the work I do every day. When I sit across from someone who has given up hope, someone who believes they are beyond help or redemption, I think of Thomas Mitchell, and I remember that no darkness is permanent, no curse is unbreakable, and no soul is ever truly lost as long as someone is willing to look beyond the surface and see the person underneath. That is the real lesson of my time in those northern woods. That is the truth that still haunts me in the best possible way. In a world that often seems consumed by fear and hatred, the most radical act we can perform is to offer understanding to those who seem beyond understanding, compassion to those who appear to deserve none, and forgiveness to those who have forgotten how to forgive themselves. Thomas Mitchell taught me that, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor the gift he gave me in return for the gift I gave him. Because in the end, we are all just lost souls trying to find our way home, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to hold out their hand in the darkness and say, "I see you, I understand. You can rest now." The story doesn't end with Thomas's redemption, though that would be a satisfying conclusion. It ends with the recognition that his story is our story, that his struggle is our struggle, that his need for understanding and forgiveness is the same need that lives in all of us. We are all capable of both great darkness and great light, and the difference between monster and human is often nothing more than the presence or absence of hope. In those woods, in that cave, in that moment of choosing compassion over fear, I learned that the most powerful force in the universe is not hunger or hatred or the desire for revenge. It is the simple, revolutionary act of seeing the divine spark in another being and choosing to nurture it rather than extinguish it. That is what saved Thomas Mitchell. That is what saved me. And perhaps if we're brave enough to practice it, that is what can save us all.